Committee will please come to order. Today the committee considers two pieces of legislation. The first bill we will be considering today is a bipartisan piece of legislation that will restrict the importation of low-level radioactive waste into the United States. The bill's sponsors, Mr. Gordon, Mr. Terry, and Mr. Matheson, have worked hard to craft a balanced bill. As a result, this bill has 80 co-sponsors, including Democrats and Republicans. At last count, 30 members of this committee are co-sponsors. As a witness from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission pointed out during our legislative hearing on this bill, there is a pure policy question here that Congress needs to answer. Should the U.S. be importing and disposing of low-level radioactive waste from other countries? This legislation ensures that the U.S. does not become a prime destination for the world's low-level radioactive waste, but it includes some sensible exceptions and a process by which the President can waive the prohibition to meet important national or international policy goals. This isn't an anti-nuclear bill. On the contrary, it ensures that there is adequate disposal capacity for the radioactive waste produced by our domestic nuclear industry. And this isn't a not-in-my-backyard bill. Utah is a likely disposal site for much of this imported waste, but Utah already disposes of 98% of our country's low-level radioactive waste. The state shouldn't be required to take radioactive waste from Italy, Brazil, and Mexico, too. The second bill we will be considering is also bipartisan. The Commercial Loudness Mitigation Act, or the Comm Act, would address a leading consumer complaint, the startling increase in volume we often experience when television programming goes to a commercial. The bill's sponsor, Congresswoman Eshoo, as well as Subcommittee Chairman Bouncer, have worked tirelessly to bring together industry and consumer groups to resolve this issue. The bill has 82 co-sponsors, including more than 15 members of the Energy and Commerce Committee. I thank the sponsors of these bills for their efforts and encourage my colleagues to support the Radioactive Import Deterrence Act and the Comm Act, and I'm looking forward to a productive markup. Chair will recognize other members who wish to make an opening statement. Let me turn to the gentleman from Florida, the ranking member of the subcommittee on communications technology and the internet.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you've mentioned, the first bill that we are considering, H.R. 515, the Radioactive Import Deterrence Act, in our opinion, needlessly seeks to prohibit the importation of low-level, Class A radioactive waste into the United States at a time when both the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission have testified there is not a Class A disposal capacity problem. So we have the space for this material. There's no need to deny because a space issue. U.S. companies currently play an integral role in the nuclear commerce around the globe and are in a position to assist countries in reducing their carbon dioxide output through the accelerated construction of new nuclear plants. However, this legislation will prevent American companies from providing state-of-the-art processing services internationally and untimely prevent the accelerated expansion of non-greenhouse gas emitting power sources like nuclear power. This bill would create an unnecessary trade barrier at a time when the administration is working on reducing trade barriers in the nuclear industry. The Department of Energy recently signed 2 nuclear cooperation agreements with Italy that call for expanding commercial relations in the field of nuclear services and the reduction of trade barriers. If this bill were to pass, U.S. companies would not be able to offer nuclear services in emerging markets because the processing facilities are located in the United States. This could mean fewer jobs and fewer tax dollars in the United States. Because of these reasons, I encourage all my colleagues to oppose this legislation. Now, the other bill we're considering, the Commercial Advertisement Loudness Mitigation Act, H.R. 1804, or the Comm Act, as the chairman mentioned. Now, this issue is a little more complex than it appears. Many different entities are responsible for producing and distributing the content consumers see and hear on their televisions. Each element may be recorded and provided at a different volume level. Moreover, shows and movies have a dynamic sound range to cover everything from a quiet scene to an explosion. Commercials, meanwhile, tend to have a narrow sound range. Volume levels are typically set for the programming, which can throw off the volume levels for commercials. 2 years ago, the Advanced Television Systems Committee established a subgroup on digital television loudness. Now, this subgroup consists of the special experts on audio technology from all the major broadcast networks, cable, production, and post-production, manufacturing, including education. Since it was established, these audio technology experts have crafted a hard-fought consensus on the recommended practice that should be employed across the TV industry to deal with TV loudness concerns. I trust the collective wisdom of these technical experts and subgroups and all their hard work to craft a solution to the TV loudness issue, and I think they should be commended. The Comm Act would simply require the FCC to adopt the standard established by this panel of experts within 1 year. The Comm Act also grants broadcasters the option of receiving up to 2 one-year waivers if purchasing the equipment to implement the standard will create a financial hardship for a broadcaster. Earlier, there was a potential concern that there may be temporary equipment supply shortage in some of the smaller markets. Because the equipment manufacturers will first accommodate the large broadcasters who have large orders, the smaller stations obviously will be forced to wait. However, it is now my understanding, Mr. Chairman, that such concerns have been addressed and no equipment supply problem will exist. I obviously want to thank Mr. Boucher, the chairman of the subcommittee where I'm ranking, and Chairman Waxman, and obviously the hard work that Ms. Eshu did for working to address these concerns. But I obviously want to keep an eye on this issue and make sure that the smaller manufacturers have the opportunity to buy this equipment after it's all sold out, bought out by the big manufacturers, and these folks are not at a financial hardship. So there's my comments, Mr. Chairman, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stearns. Mr. Dingell, do you wish to be recognized? Okay. Who seeks recognition for an opening statement? Mr. Gordon.
Chairman Waxman, thank you for holding a markup on this important bipartisan bill that would ban the importation of foreign low-level radioactive waste unless the President waives that for national security purposes. The United States stands alone in the world as the only country that imports other countries' low-level radioactive waste for permanent disposal. The RNC is currently considering the importation of 20,000 tons of radioactive waste from Italy. Permit applications are also pending for importation and disposal of Brazilian and Mexican waste. Other countries are reading the signs that the U.S. is poised to become a global dumping ground for the world's radioactive waste. Foreign waste threatens the capacity we have set aside in this country for waste generated by our own domestic industries, the medical facilities, university research labs, and utility companies. As a matter of fact, 37 states, which have 99% of our low-level radioactive waste, have no place to put it other than Utah. So I urge my colleagues to stand firm against the importation of foreign low-level radioactive waste and support this bipartisan bill as written. And I would ask unanimous consent that the committee be able to pass out the chart showing what states have no other place to send their radioactive waste.
Without objection, the unanimous consent request will be agreed to. And let me ask unanimous consent that all members be able to put into the record an opening statement in full. Who else seeks recognition for the purposes of an opening statement? Ms. Eshu?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing these bills to markup today. Obviously, I'm very pleased that both of them are. On the Comm Act, it is really legislation that's going to protect consumers from the abusive practice of blasting television commercials at high volumes in order to force viewers to pay attention to an advertiser's message. I think it has had the exact opposite effect because people really dive for the mute button. This problem has been discussed for decades, but never really properly addressed, not by the FCC and certainly not by licensees who have the obligation to protect the public interest. I think the issue has been ignored by the major stakeholders until the legislation was introduced. What I'm pleased about is that, as Mr. Stearns said, we have worked with people in industry. They have come up with the standards, but I think a very important point needs to be made here. Unless there is enforcement by the FCC, this will just turn into a voluntary endeavor. And I don't think that's good enough for consumers. So the bill takes really control of the sound and puts it back in the place where it should be with consumers so they can protect themselves. I'll be introducing a substitute amendment to make technical corrections to the version of the Comm Act that was passed by the subcommittee, and I'll just discuss the differences at that time. Suffice it to say that today's version is different than what I originally introduced because we worked with industry and their concerns and answered each issue. This is a bipartisan bill. It does have 90 co-sponsors in the House, and I look forward to its passage. And I also want to commend our colleague, Mr. Gordon, for the Radioactive Import Deterrence Act, because it really takes a common sense approach to low-level radioactive waste disposal. Our country should not be, as he said, the dumping ground for other countries' nuclear waste. I think that this is a very smart bill that's going to speak well of our country. I don't think it's anti-nuclear. I think it's pro-nuclear because of what the bill contains. So with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time and look forward to the actual markup of each bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Eshoo. Further opening statements? Mr. Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, but a couple of comments I'd just like to address on the low-level radioactive waste bill. Our hearings before this committee and actions in our federal court system have established that there is uncertainty associated with our current national policy on low-level radioactive waste. That's why Congress needs to act on this. I think this bill is the appropriate way to act, but I don't think anyone could argue that there's uncertainty about where federal policy is right now. Secondly, to the extent people think this is going to limit the expansion of nuclear power, I take issue with that. In fact, to the extent we have one location in this country for 37 different states that take 99% of our low-level radioactive waste, seems to me in a future that will be carbon constrained and likely have greater amount of nuclear power produced in this country, it makes sense to preserve this capacity for domestic waste. Now let's talk about the capacity issue. We heard from the other side that there is no capacity issue. That is really not what came out of the hearings that we held before this committee. In fact, when the GAO made its study, which by the way was based on 1 year's waste, and they just projected that 1 year's waste total out over the future, which any first-year MBA student will tell you is not the way you make projections, and it happened to be a low year that they used as their baseline year. Even then, they said 20 years, 30 years. That was kind of the boundary. Well, I don't see a whole bunch of states rushing forward to build new nuclear waste storage facilities in their state around this country right now. And so 20 years or 30 years, take your pick. That's not a long amount of time when we talk about looking at this issue. In fact, it's a rather short amount of time. So let's be careful about making blanket statements that there's no capacity problem, when in fact, for most states, there's only one place this can go, and the capacity, depending on how you want to look at the numbers, according to the hearing we had before this committee, said it's between 20 and 30 years. And finally, I'd like to address the issue of that this is an anti-trade bill. It's interesting. I always thought trade was a two-way street. And since no other country in the world takes another country's radioactive waste, I'm not clear how by this country also saying we won't take new radioactive waste, somehow we're anti-trade. I'm a real pro-trade guy. You can check my voting record and see. But I just don't think that argument holds any water. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this. I encourage my colleagues to vote for this bipartisan legislation and look forward to its passage. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. Further opening statements? Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to first congratulate Mr. Gordon and Mr. Matheson and Mr. Terry for their work on this legislation. There is, as Mr. Matheson was just pointing out, there's no other nuclear waste-producing country in the world that allows the importation and disposal of foreign nuclear waste. Why should the United States take Italian nuclear waste if they won't take ours? I think the answer is simple. We on this committee will not allow the United States to be the world's nuclear dumping ground. This bill is pro-nuclear because it will preserve existing U.S. disposal sites for our own domestic low-level nuclear waste. Today we have a few sites in the country which dispose of our low-level waste. For the moment this is adequate. However, it is extremely difficult to establish new disposal sites. It is only practical that we carefully manage what existing domestic low-level nuclear waste disposal capacity we have to ensure that we do not face a crisis in the future. But this will be even more critical if new nuclear reactors are built in this country. In the 1980s, when this committee established the low-level radioactive waste policy, it was never envisioned that foreign nuclear waste would ever be brought to the United States for disposal. I can say that with confidence because I chaired the subcommittee of jurisdiction at that time in 1985 and 86. The bill which we are considering today will close this loophole and keep foreign nuclear waste out. Again, I commend Mr. Gordon, Mr. Matheson, Mr. Terry for the excellent work on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. If there are no further opening statements, the chair calls up the bill H.R. 515, the Radioactive Import Deterrence Act, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 515, a bill to prohibit the importation of certain low-level radioactive waste into the United States.
The version before the committee is H.R. 515, as amended by the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I have.
Whitfield, do you seek recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 515, offered by Mr. Whitfield of Kentucky. Page 1, line 10.
Without objection,
strike.
the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Mr. Pitts is joining me in offering this amendment. And I might say that originally I was even a co-sponsor of this legislation, and Mr. Gordon's staff had talked to our staff about seeing if we might be able to reach some agreement, and we genuinely appreciate their extending that offer. But during the discussions, it became obvious that we just had different views on this. Our amendment, I believe, clarifies a number of issues of concern that has been expressed. First of all, I would note that obviously we already have a domestic business that is in the business of disposing of Class A waste, low-level waste. Mr. Markey made the comment that other countries did not take low-level waste to dispose of, and my understanding from talking to our staff and review, other countries do take low-level waste from other countries for storage purposes. But one of the issues that's always been concerned about this is the capacity for disposal that we have in this country. And it's my understanding that we have up to about 130 years of capacity that is available with the opportunity to obtain more. I might also say that over the last 20 years or so, 14 licenses have been granted to bring low-level waste into this country. Now, these companies that dispose of waste, they create jobs, they provide jobs, and as I say, even if we are successful, if you're successful in banning all low-level waste from coming into the country for disposal, we're still going to be conducting that activity in the U.S. Now, one of the also concerns is that the material might be coming into the U.S. that was unintended. that should not be here. And we, in this amendment, give the Regulatory Commission, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they will grant an export license to the company bringing the material in, so that if it is discovered during the inspection process that material came in that should not be in, then it will be immediately exported. So our amendment requires the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to take into consideration the domestic capacity, which they do not necessarily have to do right now. Second, the amendment requires the company seeking a license to obtain an export license to move out any material that may be here incorrectly. And lastly, the amendment requires the company to report to the NRC that the material they are importing is the correct material. And it directs the NRC to conduct random spot checks to ensure that the company is abiding by the terms of the license. And additionally, should a company be caught importing substances not allowed, they would be subject to fines under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. Or the company could lose its license to import any future material. So the amendment's pretty straightforward. You eventually come down to a question of, are we going to... Another reason I might add that I think we should support this is there's a court case right now in the Federal Court of Appeals addressing this issue, and that has not been completed at this time. And the Obama administration right today is negotiating a nuclear cooperation agreement with Italy. And this material that we're talking about for this particular license right now pending is coming from Italy. So for all of those reasons, I believe it's short-sighted to just put a blanket prohibition on this low-level waste material that can be easily disposed of. I would like to yield. Did you want 5 minutes yourself,
No,
Mr.
I don't. I just need about a minute.
Okay. May I yield to balance my time to Mr. Pitts? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that Mr. Whitfield and I are offering addresses capacity issues. I think it will strengthen the bill, the need to prevent anything but the lowest level of waste from entering the country, and the NRC's ability to oversee the waste entering the country. Our amendment takes into account anticipated future domestic waste levels, because we do not want domestic capacity to be jeopardized in any way. If a capacity issue does arise, the license holder must have a valid export license to immediately send back the waste, and the license company must also have an export license for anything imported not on their license. Our amendment also requires the import licensee to certify they're importing the material for which they have a license. In order to ensure this, the NRC will conduct random inspections of the substance being imported. And if a company is found to be violating the terms of their license, the NRC will revoke the license, and the company is subject to penalties under the Atomic Energy Act. So this amendment ensures that the strictest standards will accompany the importation of low-level waste, and I believe it makes the bill stronger and more realistic, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pitt. And Mr. Whitfield, further discussion of the amendment? Yes, gentleman from Tennessee.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
My friend from Kentucky, neighbor from Kentucky, was the original co-sponsor of this bill, and also it was his letter as well as Ranking Member Joe Barton's letter to the NRC that made us aware of this. So I know he's not trying to be mischievous here. This is a sincere effort. But I think that it's misguided in that the amendment leaves it up to the RNC to decide when our disposal sites are so full that bringing in more foreign waste would threaten our future capacity needs. But there's no definitions. It just says in the view, in the NRC's view. Well, my view, if I was on the NRC, is that for 37 states with 99% of the low-level radioactive waste in this country, they only have one place to go. And so for every ton that we put in there, that's one less ton that we can get in of our own. So I think view is too nebulous. He mentioned the court case that was pending right now. Let me tell you about the court case. The citizens and the governor of Utah, where the low-level radioactive waste is destined, says they don't want it. And the states in the compact say they don't want it. But the monopoly company that's trying to bring it in is suing them to make them take it. He says that there are other countries that will accept low-level waste. We can't find that, and so I would welcome that to be clarified. Also, there was my friend from Florida talks about harming U.S. Again, trade. Well, the fact of the matter is U.S. companies can go to Italy, to Mexico, anywhere else they want to, and set up the disposal plants there, just like all the other countries do. And we would welcome and support they do that. Also, again, we need to make it clear that this is by no means an anti-nuclear proposal. Representative Matheson, Representative Terry, and myself are all pro-nuke. We feel like it's got to play a role in whatever is going to be our new climate change proposal. In the Senate, Senator Alexander is the sponsor there. He's more than pro. He's super pro. And so that certainly isn't an issue. So really, once again, it all boils down to this. There's only one country in the world that accepts low-level radioactive waste from other nations for permanent disposal. That is the United States. 37 states in this country, representing 99% of all of our radioactive waste, have no place to take it other than to Utah. And whatever goes in there from another country means there's something else that can't go in from our country. Now, everybody can raise their hand that wants to be the next disposal site, but I think that's going to be very difficult to find. So I think this is important, good public policy, and as much as I respect my friend, I think that this amendment would put us on the wrong path, and I would oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Further discussion. Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to rise in support of the Whitfield Amendment. You know, I'm troubled by a pattern I see emerging on the committee. Several weeks ago, we passed a bill that will put four plants in the United States that use a specific process that uses mercury, put them out of business. Today, if this bill passes committee, and the indications are that it will, we're going to pass another bill that makes it impossible for some U.S. companies to conduct a legal business for which they have been certificated and passed all the compliance tests to do so. I know it's messy and difficult to deal with the reality of the world, and that there are products that, if not used properly, are harmful and that need to be disposed of properly to prevent contamination to the population. But the fact of the matter is that that's reality. And luckily, we have companies in the United States and processes in the United States that are the best in the world. And in this case, low-level nuclear waste, or radioactive waste, I should say, it's not a good thing, but you know, when you go to have a medical procedure done and they want to put some radioactive isotopes in your body to see if the cancer is spread, that's a good thing. When we have an X-ray of our body and the technician has to use certain protective clothing, and then you have to dispose of that clothing, that's a good thing. And so I'm just troubled, Mr. Chairman, that my good friend from Tennessee, who's served in this committee and this Congress as long as I have, has decided to offer or proffer a bill that says we're just not going to allow certain things to come into this country. So what the Whitfield Amendment does is says let's take a inventory of the disposal capacity in the United States, and if it's adequate, and if the company that wants to import this to that facility has got a license, we'll let that happen. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of a conditional thing. We still have the NRC as the watchdog and the protector of our workforce and the protector of our population. I think we could accept this, and it would improve the bill. So while I don't hold out any great hope, Mr. Chairman, I support the bill and would ask the members of the committee to support it. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Further discussion of the amendment.
Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Stearns.
Respect to requisite number of words. As I understand this, Mr. Chairman, there was a court case, and the court case was in favor of this facility in Clive, Utah, importing this type of nuclear radioactivity, which is sort of a class, a very minor class of radioactivity. And so one of the things you could argue is, why not, before we pass this bill, Mr. Chairman, let the court process the appeal and let it go through the courts, let them decide. They're doing it rigorously through testimony and subpoena witnesses and depositions. And so at this point, it appears that this bill would negate the court case. And in fact, the court case is being appealed, so I'm not sure the bill is even required. The gentleman from Utah mentioned that there are no new facilities. As I understand, Texas has a new facility scheduled to open in 2010 or 2011. It should, if this bill doesn't pass, be able to help take some of this low-level waste from Vermont and other states. And other states could choose to open facilities too. And as pointed out by others, that the facility in Clive, Utah, was taking waste disposable material from Italy. So obviously other countries are involved with this, at least the exporting of it, but as I understand, France is also storing it. So I rise and support, as a compromise, the Whitfield Amendment, because in the end, he's saying that if, by golly, we have the capacity, and the nuclear NRC decides that they have the capacity, why not let them make the decision and let the capacity be used? So I rise in support of the Whitfield Amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back this time. Mr. Matheson.
Just like move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recommendation.
I mentioned in my opening statement that there is this court case that has helped expose the gap in federal policy. Mr. Markey, in his opening statement, mentioned when he was chairman of the subcommittee back in 1985 that it wasn't even considered. The issue of importation of foreign waste wasn't even considered. And so what we have is a situation where we have this process in our country where we set up these regional compacts that decide about storage of waste. And Energy Solutions has a license that's outside of the compact. And so who's in charge here of making this decision? State of Utah doesn't want it. The Northwest Compact says they don't think they should be allowed. They took a vote to disallow this waste because it was coming from a foreign country. The court suit is questioning whether or not the state or the compact even have the authority to do that. And the NRC says we don't have the authority to make that decision. That's not part of what we do. So that's the whole point of this court case. However it comes down is that it points out that there's a vague component to our current low-level radioactive waste policy. That's why we ought to be here. That's why we ought to be talking about this bill. And as was mentioned, the court case right now is on appeal. We don't know how that's going to turn out, but this is really a policy issue. I don't think this is one where the courts ought to be deciding what our policy ought to be. The courts are instead deciding under the laws that exist today who has the authority to make these decisions. That's the essence of the court case. But our job in the legislative branch is to set policy. And the court case helps validate that there is this gap in policy, and that's why we're here. Now, I think this amendment is not the way to go. I think it reduces the impact of this bill. I think we ought to make a clear statement about where this country is, since no other country will take another country's foreign radioactive waste. I encourage my colleagues to defeat the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure, I'll yield. I'll yield to the ranking member.
First of all, I have great respect for the gentleman from Utah, and I understand his constituent interest in this, and I certainly respect the amount of effort that both he and Mr. Gordon have put into this. But my question is, based on what you just said, why not clarify who has the authority to make a decision rather than just preempt and say that none of this material shall be allowed into the United States? If your argument is there's ambiguity right now in the current law about where the decision is made, why not introduce a bill that clarifies who gets to make the decision under what circumstances?
Well, I guess my response from my perspective is I think Congress ought to be the one who makes that decision. Okay. I think that's why we ought to pass this bill. You may have a difference of opinion and think a regulatory agency ought to make a decision about whether or not we ought to be importing foreign waste. I think my position is Congress ought to make that decision. That's why I think we ought to pass the bill. I'll yield back.
Will the gentleman yield, just for a question?
One more. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
no matter how this court case is decided, this court case will only affect Clyde, Utah, right? It's not going to affect all the other facilities in the United States.
Well, not being an attorney, I'm not sure I can give you a legal opinion on what that's going to be, but as my understanding,
Let's
this court
assume
case
that's
is
true.
relative to this.
Then actually, the rest of the people are operating within the law, and this legislation is going to change that. So in terms of policy, these other facilities are operating within the law.
Well,
So
I have to confess,
why is that wrong?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't see a lot of states in this country begging for foreign radioactive waste or operate. You mentioned that. I don't see this happening anywhere.
Well, as I told you, Texas is trying to open a facility next year.
Reclaiming my time, perhaps there's another facility opening. I have yet to see any other place where there's suggestion that we ought to store foreign radioactive waste in this country. So, yes, this happens to be in my state, but at least for 37 states, it's taking the facility. It's the only place they can go right now for their low-level radioactive waste. That represents 99% of the volume of low-level radioactive waste throughout this country. So the court case is what it is. I'm just suggesting it's also exposed this gap in federal policy. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is there further discussion of the Whitfield Amendment? If not, let's proceed to a vote. All those in favor of the Whitfield Amendment say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The noes have it, and the amendment's not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the...
I would like to ask for a roll call vote.
Gentleman requests a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman?
No.
Mr. Waxman, no. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle, no. Mr. Markey? Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone, no. Mr. Gordon? Mr. Gordon, no. Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo, no. Mr. Stupak? Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Ms. DeGette? Ms. DeGette, no. Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon? Ms. Schakowsky? Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Inslee? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Weiner? Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Melanson? Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen? Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes, no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Space? Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton? Ms. Sutton, no. Mr. Braley? Mr. Welch? Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, aye. Mr. Hall? Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, aye. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, aye. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, aye. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, aye. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. I'm sorry, Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 17, the nays were 26.
17 ayes, 26 noes, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Mr. Markey, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
To strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I first learned of this issue when the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson, and a gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Gordon, came to visit me to make their eloquent case for this legislation. They spoke with one voice. They wanted a definitive hearing on the issue which we had, and then they wanted to put together a piece of legislation. And that message which they gave me, that they spoke in unison on, is something that I would like to share with all of you this morning, which I think summarizes this issue in a nutshell. With apologies to that great Italian-American Dean Martin. When the trash piles high reaches up to the sky, no amore. Roman nuclear waste, will it come to the states to be dumped? It may come 20,000 tons, 20,000 tons. Utah says that's no Bella. We don't want that imported junk, Hold on, fellas. Scusa me, NRC, we and old Tennessee say no more.
The gentleman not only struck the last word, he struck the last note.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Barton, do you wish to be recognized for a song or
no.
to speak?
No. I'm not going to put us through that. I didn't know Dean Martin, but that was no Dean Martin.
That is why I apologize.
If there are no further amendments to the bill, the vote now comes on reporting H.R. 515 with a recommendation that the bill pass. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone, aye. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon, aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo, aye. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette, aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, aye. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Melanson. I'm sorry. Mr. Matheson, I apologize. Mr. Matheson, aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui, aye. Mrs. Christensen. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, aye. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, aye. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton, aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley, aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch, aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton, no. Mr. Hall. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton, no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns, no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Deal, aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shadig. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer, aye. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, no. Ms. Bonomack. Ms. Bonomack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Murphy of Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn, no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise, no. Mr. Melanson. Ms. Melanson votes aye. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes aye.
Okay.
Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel, aye. Mr. Sullivan is off, aye, and on, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy is off, aye, and on, no.
Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will tally the vote. Clerk will announce the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on the final passage, the vote was 34 ayes and 12 noes.
34 ayes, 12 noes. The bill is approved and as amended. We now call up H.R. 1084, the Commercial Advertising Loudness Mitigation Act, the Comm Act. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1084, a bill to require the Federal Communications Commission to prescribe a standard to preclude commercials from being broadcast at louder volumes than the program material.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read. The version before the committee is H.R. 1084, as amended by the Subcommittee on Communications Technology and the Internet.
Mr. Chairman, the committee is not in order.
Gentleman is correct. Committee will please come back to order. Are there any amendments to the bill? Ms. Escher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of substitute.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to finalize the language of 1084, the Comm Act, or as many people throughout the country know it, the loud commercial law. During the, and I'm not going to sing it, so during the subcommittee markup on this bill, I agreed to work with the committee staff and to review the industry concerns prior to bringing the bill to the full committee. And I'm pleased to say that we kept that promise. In fact, we've been working with industry since the inception of the bill. The subcommittee mark already reflected significant changes to the Act's structure. Instead of an open-ended FCC rulemaking, the current bill, as passed out of the subcommittee, adopts industry standards for noise level mitigation and modulation. Those standards took effect informally on November 4th of this year, when the Advanced Television Systems Committee, the ATSC, approved its recommended practices for audio loudness. But industry standards lack teeth and enforcement mechanisms. The industry has been reluctant to move ahead on this issue, and that's why Congress needs to set the standard and enforce the timeline. It's taken almost half a century after the problem was first identified to come up with a response. So the substitute tweaks the current version to provide some clarifying points. First, the amendment will delete the word severe from modifying financial hardship waivers for broadcasters and multi-video providers, so that it's clear that bankruptcy would not be the only qualification for a waiver, in line with other commission waivers. Second, the language limits the FCC rulemaking to the adoption of the ATSC standards, something I did to satisfy the National Association of Broadcasters' complaints about a prolonged rulemaking that might create onerous standards. Third, clarifying language ensures that everyone has more than enough time to comply, and that's very important. In addition to the time it takes the Commission to adopt the rules, broadcasters and multi-channel providers will have a one-year period to comply with the rules and purchase the necessary electronics equipment. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership, to Mr. Boucher, who has been a consistent supporter and helper on the legislation, to all of the co-sponsors. I thank you. I look forward to a passage of this bill today and final passage by the full House. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Further discussion of the SU amendment? Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't here to make an opening statement, so I'm sort of going to make an opening statement on this amendment. First, in terms of technical workmanship and competence, I have to commend my good friend Congresswoman Eshoo and Mr. Boucher and others for their their efforts to technically improve the bill. But having said that, this is not an issue that I think is worthy of the federal preemption. There's so many things you can do if you don't particularly like a commercial. You don't have to watch that channel. You can mute it. You can do something besides watch TV. You could go out and play with your children, or, as I need to do, you could go wash laundry. I haven't washed laundry in a month up here. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things you could do. But if we're going to begin to federally dictate the noise level, what about commercials where people wear funny hats? What about commercials that advertise products that we don't particularly care for? What about some of these crazy used car commercials where, you know, Friendly Sam says, come on down right now and I'll beat any deal in town, and if you don't, you know, you shave my head off or whatever. I mean, I just don't get it. You know, I'm the television age. I remember when TV came out in the night, or at least when we got our first TV set in the 1950s, and there have been commercials on TV ever since I've been watching it that I'd rather not have watched. So why all of a sudden do we have to have this particular bill? And again, on technical merit, it's a good bill. You know, you're going to work with the industry. The industry's going to set standards. The FCC is going to do all this. But heaven's sake, I just don't see this committee determining now that we have to dictate a standard for the audio level of a commercial. That just seems.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman, and yeah, we've worked on lots of things together. And while I appreciate your saying what you're saying, I don't agree. And let me just make a couple of comments here. We're not regulating content, number one, and that's a very important thing to set forth. These very loud commercials, these loudness issues, are within the purview of the FCC. So this isn't something that that this bill is inventing, a new purview for the FCC. It is within their purview, and the bill obviously sets forth the FCC to enforce, and we've worked with all the stakeholders. Lastly, and I think most importantly, I think we all need to remind ourselves that broadcasters use the public airwaves. These are not private airwaves. They're public. And so this is not the be-all and end-all legislation when it comes to the problems that we have and the huge challenges in our country. But I do think it's a consumer issue. And consumers have weighed in at the FCC for decades. It is the top complaint of consumers across the country to the FCC. So while I think it is an important step, perhaps a small one relative to the issues and the challenges the country faces, I have to tell you, if you took a vote of the Spouses Club around here, you know, I mean, it's like it's their favorite bill, and your constituents will thank you for weighing in on it because, as Chairman Boucher said at the subcommittee, this is in terms of popularity right up there with the do not call list because it makes sense to people. It's relevant to them. So I thank the gentleman for yielding, and those are my thoughts in response to yours.
I mean, I know the handwriting's on the wall on this, but my memory's going, Mr. Chairman, but it seems like in the early days of Saturday Night Live, there were some characters on Saturday Night Live that they were always complaining about everything, and they were always kind of cranky, and there was just one thing after the other. I think it should tell us something. If this is the number one complaint at the FCC for the last 50 years and they haven't acted upon it, there's a reason, and that's because we still expect some people to take some responsibility for their actions. And again, we don't force people to watch these commercials. We don't force people to watch TV. So why in the world are we now going to set standards for the audio level because people are too lazy are just, they would rather government do it for them than them doing it themselves. So I'm opposed to it, and I hope that by some miracle we vote this bill down.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'm minus 26 seconds, but I'll be happy to yield.
There's another skit on the Saturday Night Live show that comes to mind. It was a little skit of an outfit called the Loud Family.
Maybe that's
every time someone said, "How you doing, hon?" "Oh, I'm fine, sweetheart." Every little conversation was like that, and it exemplified the fact that raising the volume invades people's space.
Then turn it off.
Well, the point is you have to affirmatively do that constantly. In order to be able to enjoy what you have a right to enjoy, you have to put up with what you shouldn't have to put up with. And I guess that's the
Watch C-SPAN instead. Don't watch Saturday Night Live.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Boucher, I want
to we couldn't hear down here, and I was wondering if they could speak a little louder.
That's why we make transcripts of everything that has been said. Mr. Boucher, do you wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman, let me just briefly say that we reported this measure by voice vote from the subcommittee. It was broadly supported at that time, and I think for good reason. We're all very frustrated when the commercial has a volume that's much greater than the program with which it's associated. We scrambled for the remote control, and we turned the volume down. Then we have to pick it up again, turn the volume back up when the program recommences and the commercial's over. It's just frustrating and annoying, and we have an opportunity here to do something about it. And let me simply point out that the industry has accommodated and endorsed this approach. The standard that will be adopted by the FCC is the standard that has been developed by the industry-based standards committee. And so this can well be accommodated by the TV stations. We also have a waiver in this measure for any TV station that has financial hardship in meeting these standards. And so this certainly does no harm. I think it does a great deal of good, and I hope it's the committee's pleasure to accept it.
Further discussion? Are we ready for the
Chairman?
Yes, Mr.
Yes, shortly. I understand where my ranking member, Mr. Barton's coming from. In fact, to lend credence to his argument, the fact is that the Advanced Television System Committee, they essentially established a subgroup on digital television loudness. And all these experts in production, post-production, manufacturing, education, broadcast networks, and cable all came together as a result of all these complaints to the FCC, and they came up with a solution. Now, one of the arguments that I made during the subcommittee is that why not let private industry solve this problem? Because private industry has put together this subgroup, and they came up with a solution. The gentlelady from California sort of agreed with that, but she's saying, let's move it along. And so her bill is basically to say, let's put a time frame on this when this occurs. And I think her impatience in some respects is merited because these people have been studying it, and so they agree it's a problem. They testified it's a problem. The National Association of Broadcasters obviously is not endorsing this bill, but they're not opposing this bill is the way I understand it. So in some sense, Mr. Barton's correct that this is something that industry could solve itself, but Ms. Eskew is probably correct in the sense that let's put a little timeline on this.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will in a second.
Okay.
The thing about this manager's amendment, which is good, is that there would be a severe hardship for some of these small broadcasters because once this equipment is sold, you got to pay for it, and second of all the big broadcasters will buy it, and the small ones might not get it, and yet the gentlelady from California has put this timeline on so that if they don't, they're breaking the law. So she's put in this manager's amendment some relief, which is good. So I commend her in this manager's amendment by saying that in the event of severe hardship, financial or bankruptcy, that these companies get this waiver. The original one-year waiver, an option of receiving up to 2-year one-year waivers is in the bill, but you added some technical language, which I commend you for doing. It makes it better and easier. And I would comment to her and also to the ranking chairman, Mr. Boucher, that in the event the bill starts moving into a conference or there's technical language is needed to protect some of these small manufacturers in the event the equipment is not available for them to get it. So I think, it's a bill, as Mr. Barton pointed out, it's not a high priority. It's not a bill that is, shall we say, couldn't be solved by industry itself, except, on the other hand, This has been waffling along for these many years. The FCC gets all these complaints, and I think the gentlelady from California says, let's speed it up. And I yield to the gentlelady.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing, and I appreciate the gentleman yielding, and that is that I salute the organization that came up with the standards. I think everyone should note that they came up with them November 9th of this year. So the legislation has had a positive effect on them. I doubt that that would have been the case unless the legislation was on the table. So it has produced, I think, a salutary outcome, and I appreciate the compliments of the ranking member.
Will gentleman yield?
I'll yield, yes.
Gentleman yield to me?
Yes. Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
You know, Anna, I would change the title of your bill. I would change it to the something like Marital Civility Act. Because when I get home,
we'll leave that legislation to
the
you.
Marital Civility Act. Because when I get home and I'm watching some program, I'm either in the kitchen or the living room, and my wife Joni will walk in and she'll yell at me and say, "Turn down the television," and I'll say, "It's a commercial. It's a commercial." I can't be the only one in America that this happens to, you know. And it is annoying, and it is rather unfortunate to think that Congress, that we have to take of our time to address an annoyance. But Anna, maybe this is what is required to get people to act, And Mr. Shimkus is correct. The private sector always likes to go out there and find some type of correction, and to be able to filter this kind of stuff out. But maybe my hope is, Anna, is that this actually gets the FCC to move, to actually regulate this, and I'm hopeful that we don't have to do it legislatively. But I'll go ahead and I'm going to support you in this process, but I'm hopeful that they do it without us having to do it by law. I yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield to the chairman, Mr. Barton, the ranking member.
Well, if we're in this spirit of things that annoy us, I'd like Congresswoman Eshoo and Mr. Stearns to introduce a bill soon to repeal the excessive celebration rule in sports. It just really irritates me when my team actually scores a touchdown, or then all of a sudden they get penalized because they hold the football up. That just really hacks me off. Could we work on that? Let's really do some stuff that, if we're going to do annoying things, let's get rid of that excessive celebration thing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Markey, do you want to be recognized for 30 seconds?
Well, I thank the chair. Perhaps 1 minute. Thank you. See, here's how this problem, and I thank the gentlelady for identifying this very, very important issue. And the gentleman from Indiana has spoken to it. I think we all have a concern about this, and it manifests itself in different ways. For us in Boston, it's when the Red Sox are playing the Seattle Mariners or the Los Angeles Angels. The game starts at 11 o'clock at night.
That is annoying.
Well, but Red Sox Nation is a faithful nation, and so we start watching the game at 11 o'clock at night. Now, we all know we're going to fall asleep on the couch watching it, but there's a couple of million people watching the Red Sox. It's just the way it is. And so we kind of make a secret plan with ourselves, knowing that we cannot stay up for the whole game, but we're going to start. And we know we're going to fall asleep on the couch. So as the Red Sox have won, or one of the teams on the West Coast have defeated us, excessive celebration breaks out. But that doesn't wake us up. What wakes us up is the commercial that then runs right after the excessive celebration, okay? And now we're there, and we're planning, actually, on sleeping on the couch. But the advertisement has now woken us up.
Well, just do away with commercials during Red Sox.
All we want them to be is at the same level as the excessive celebration at the end of a sporting event, which maintains the same level. So the gentlelady has put her finger on a big, big problem. I hope that we can find a way of giving her the
gentleman yield
for this legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. Without objection, we're going to go right to the vote. I think everyone who has a view on this has been loud and clear.
Mr. Chairman, can I say to Mr. Markey, when Coach Belichick makes those kind of judgments, you have no celebration in Boston.
Yeah, then you have to calm down the decibel level of our fans. Okay, that can be heard across the country.
The vote comes now on the SU amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The vote now comes on reporting H.R. 1084 as amended with the recommendation that the bill pass. All those in favor quietly say aye. And those opposed loudly say no. And it didn't help you. You weren't loud enough. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. That completes our business, and we stand adjourned.